Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Troy Kilpatrick. I'm the Executive Director here at the Journey Museum and Learning Center. Thank you for coming out on a special day, Veterans Day. We appreciate you being here at the Journey Museum and Learning Center. Today's program, I know she's not going to be able to hear you, but clap anyway, and I'll try to stick my microphone out. Corey Christianson has been with the Journey Museum and Learning Center for several years, and her story goes back to in 2020, we all experienced a pandemic, and not only did Corey have a pandemic, but then she had to go to peer. She actually likes peer quite a bit. But one of the things we learned is that we didn't have to have everybody working in an office next to each other, so she's been able to continue to do research on the 72 flood, work in Pierce, central part of the state, and we're just darn glad that that's continued. When you leave today, if you haven't had a chance to see the 50th, the commemoration of the 1972 flood exhibit out in the front lobby, Corey was integral in getting that built along with Simpson's Printing. That exhibit has won the Mountain Plains Museum Association Award for Leadership and Innovation. It has won the South Dakota Museum Award for Excellence in Programming. We had originally intended to maybe not have the exhibit still up at this time of the year, but because of the recognition that we're getting, and we felt it would be appropriate for us to do programs in November and December about some of the important aspects and stories, such as the first responders who were involved in the 1972 flood here on Veterans Day. Next Friday, we're doing a program. Banji O'Neill from the Salvation Army is going to talk about William and Joy Medley, who were big figures in the history of the 72 flood itself. And then we're going to skip, take a little break for Thanksgiving. We'll come back, and Jim Kenyon's going to talk about Father William O'Connell. And Corey's going to do a program we've never done before or presented. That is 1973, the year after the flood. What happened in our community? What was the experiences? How did the rebuild start to go? And as we take a look back on that, there was a heck of a lot of decisions that had to be made by our community leadership. And it's important for us to make sure that everybody understands us. This program today is being recorded, and it is part of an IMLS CARES grant, as those other aspects of the 72 flood. So you can find the programs that we did the week of June 9th this summer on journeymuseum.org, Black Hills Flood, and you can see all the different programs that were done. There's a concert, there's a program by Mayor Don Barnett at that time, there's a program with Dr. Stephen Hausman, and there's a couple community program that was done where people came up and spoke. All those are there, they're free of charge. This will be packaged eventually with that, as will next Friday's program, and then the program on Father William O'Connell. So we're just trying to kind of make sure that we continue to enrich all of our knowledge and the history of the flood here. I have one more thing before I turn this over to Corey. Special kudos. Everybody clap as loud as you can. Corey was just nominated or just become one of the 30 under 30 for the University of South Dakota for her accomplishments as a researcher here at the Journey Museum and Learning Center. So we're darn proud of her. Let's give her as big a round of applause again. Can you hear any of that, Corey?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, I'll turn it over to Corey Christianson. We'll leave the lights up. I think we got good enough view, or do you guys want it dark? The lights will stay on. Corey, you've got the mic.
All right. Hello, everybody. Due to weather, I was not able to make it out to Rapid because it is still snowing in Pierre. We haven't gotten much. We've just gotten ice for the most part. But today I'm here to talk to you guys about first responders during the 1972 Black Hills flood. I do want to start this presentation, though, by talking about just a quick overview, kind of what the Journey Museum's role is and important facts and figures for you all to know. So the Journey Museum and Learning Center has proudly aligned itself with the 1972 Black Hills flood commemoration in a multitude of ways. Troy touched on a couple of aspects of what we've been doing. The exhibit and the collaborative programming that we've done has won some awards this year, which has been very exciting. The Journey Museum has also worked very hard to change verbiage. So during this presentation, you're actually going to hear some of those words that we've changed, including commemoration, fatalities, and Black Hills flood. So those are all in place instead of anniversary, victims, and Rapid City flood. We're trying to make it more inclusive, and we're trying to be more specific and very, there's a word that I can't think of right now. We're trying to be very purposeful about what we say. The Journey Museum has also continued to do research outside of the exhibit and outside of what has been ongoing. We're still working on researching fatalities of the flood. There is a publication coming out in December in South Dakota History, which is the State Historical Society's journal that they put out on the green spaces of the flood. That was written by myself on behalf of the Journey Museum and Learning Center. So if you are interested, please look that up. It hopefully will be out in the next month or so. So important facts and figures. There were over 200 fatalities during the 1972 Black Hills flood. We are going to talk about some of them today because some of them were first responders. $165 million in damages in 1972 actually correlates to being, and I have, side note, I have notes in front of me, so if I look down, that's why. It correlates to being $1,171,610,526.32 as of October of 2022. So it is over $1 billion in damages in today's money. And thousands were displaced during the flood. Thousands of people lost their homes and could not go back to where they had their homes. And some, because of this, some returned to Rapid City and some did not. When we're talking about first responders, we are actually referring to individuals who are trained to respond to disasters, dangerous situations, or are in active military service. If we were to just, everybody who attempted or actively tried to save someone the night of the flood could be considered a first responder, and that list would be enormous. They all deserve recognition, but in this case, we're talking about individuals who were trained to respond to tragedies or dangerous situations. This includes the Rapid City Police Department, the Fire Department, South Dakota Highway Patrol, the U.S. Air Force through Ellsworth Air Force Base, and the South Dakota National Guard. All of my information that is being presented to you today is actually coming from what I fondly refer to as the Blue Book. This is what it looks like. It is a historical document of compiled reports on the flood, including reports from first responder agencies, hospitals. There are reports in there from, like, Department of Social Services has a report in there, reports from the Department of Agriculture. Don Barnett has multiple reports in there, from letters to writings that he's submitted to the book. And it's accessible through the Rapid City Public Library. I have the URL here up on the screen, and I can come back to this slide later if anybody wants to take a picture of it. And of course, like Troy said, this will be accessible on the website. So to begin, I want to give just a general overview of these reports. Many of the reports, or actually I'm going to say all of the reports give some sort of timeline of events. And those timelines all kind of read the same way. There's an alert of flooding around 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night from further west in the Black Hills. And then around 7:30 or 8 o'clock, most of the off shift people get called in, and then there's chaos. And that's essentially how the reports go. It's this is purposely done, this is purposely done. And then the writings within the reports are chaotic at best, which is very understandable because of what was happening at the time. This presentation is also not going to dive too deeply into specific numbers and aspects of the reports, because if I were to do that, I could probably do a full day on this topic alone. So after the presentation, if anybody has questions, I do have the blue book pulled up. And if I don't know the answer, I can look it up for you really quick. I also highly recommend you go and look at the blue book on your computers as well. Do keep in mind that some of the reports are very stark, they're very heart-wrenching, they're very tragic. So if you're not comfortable reading those things, I would stay away from the blue book, because there are reports in there that have made me want to cry before, because of how serious and devastating this tragedy actually was. So to begin, we're going to talk about the police department. This image is of the Rapid City Police Department on the day of June 9th, 1972. You can see it's a cloudy gray day outside. This was done the morning of the flood, I think around 10 a.m. The report that I'm working off of here is actually Lieutenant Hennies' report. And Lieutenant Hennies, Tom Hennies, went on to become the chief of the Rapid City Police Department. But at the time of the flood, he was a lieutenant. And if you can see my mouse right here, this is the gentleman in question with his bright red shirt and his white tie in the front row. Tom Hennies' report was submitted June 28th of 1972. So about 21 days after the flood, so about 3 weeks after the flood. It highlights his and others' actions during the flood. And he specifically calls out 2 officers beside himself. He calls out Officer Rurode and Officer Roach, and I will mention them. So according to Hennies' report, he reported to work that day at about 2:15, which is to them was a normal shift change time, along with 10 other men. At this point, nothing was really happening. They had started getting reports of flooding more westwardly, but it hasn't really hit Rapid City yet. And then at 7, 3 more men showed up to work. From there, chaos kind of started happening. Hennies did say that by about 2 a.m., everybody had made it to work. Even those off-duty officers, those who had been on vacation, everybody had somehow made it to the headquarters, which had flooded by that point. So they actually housed themselves in the courthouse. What Hennies then goes on to describe, and I'm going to make it as a brief summary as possible, is a night of terror in his report. Hennies goes on to talk about how he had to leave his patrol car at one point because it had been flooded, and he was picked up by a fire engine and rescued himself. He could not even make it to the Bennett Clarkson nursing home to help evacuate people there because of the flooding. He states that in the report, he states that at 2 a.m., he had the opportunity to go to his parents' house, change into dry clothes, and then get back out. He said he was only there for about 10 minutes with another officer, and then he went back to work. Officer Rue Road was highlighted in the report. He worked along Omaha Street between West Boulevard and the fairgrounds. He and other volunteers were actively rescuing people most of the night. They had lashed together 2 boats and had created a pulley system to rescue people out of the water. This all came from volunteers, as at the time, according to Lieutenant Hennies, the officers' cars did not have as much rescue material as they would have liked. So a lot of volunteers brought out the boats, they brought out the rope, they brought out anything and everything that could be used to rescue these individuals. And then Officer Roach was also highlighted, and Officer Roach is kind of, his heroism has been recognized multiple times over the years. The Rapid City Police Department, I believe, actually did a Facebook post on him this year during the flood, or during the commemoration of the flood. He was lauded with saving people from the nursing home near Jackson Boulevard and Mountain View. He evacuated people for over an hour and a half. And he claims that he had volunteers with him, helping him rescue these individuals, but nobody's actually been able to verify who was volunteering with him. So many officers were under the impression that that was just him saying he had help to take away the attention on himself. Tom Hennies goes on, when he's talking about Officer Sam Roach, he goes on to say, Sam was alone so far as police help was concerned and did accomplish much by his own wits. Most interestingly, in this report though, Hennies goes on to talk about what would be needed in case something like this were to ever happen again. And this is where I find the reports to be the most fascinating, because these reports are coming straight from individuals who survived. And so they have no qualms about putting their opinions in these reports. So Tom Hennies lists out 9 things in his report that could have been helpful for the next time there's a tragedy. And this is 72. So a lot of these things that he mentions now are actively in place today. Tom, at the end of his report, Lieutenant Hennies goes, I feel that I must take the time to praise the work of all involved. Our men accomplished much with nothing. They worked days without proper food or sleep and still returned to work some more. The police did not make it out unscathed. They did lose 1 officer the night of the flood. Officer Wickard was a volunteer reserve officer, and he was working with another officer during the night of the flood, and he died trying to rescue other individuals. He was 26 at the time. In fact, I think the oldest first responder who had died during the flood was 40. Officer Wickard is buried in the Black Hills National Cemetery, I believe. The fire department, they lost 3 people that night, and we will touch on that. Their report is different than Lieutenant Hennies. It is much more, Lieutenant Hennies told a story in his report. The fire department's report was very much more a timeline of events. And I'll read some of it. So it breaks up the actions by time. At approximately 1800 hours, so 6 o'clock, there were 20 men on duty throughout the city of Rapid City at all the different police stations. They were kind of scattered. And then at 21:30, the fire chief called back all off-duty firemen. At approximately 10:45 to 11 o'clock, the report says this: with all the fire department units and firemen in operation at this time, the big onrush of water, apparently from the dam going out at Canyon Lake, caused problems throughout the city simultaneously. At this point, the report breaks into sections, and it says, these houses were breaking down and catching on fire, so we responded there. These cars were flooding, so we responded there. It doesn't mention picking up Lieutenant Henny's in the report, but that is a story that is passed around. The report ends with a list of damages done, what they've lost, and that sort of thing. It says fire department units and manpower were in full scale effect until 1700 hours on June 12th, 1972. Peak manning level for the fire department reached a total of 71 personnel on duty at any one time. This photo comes from Kelloland, and it is the fire department truck that we had outside the Journey Museum in June. This truck was on duty the night of the flood. And the fire department did lose 3 individuals. They lost Captain George A. Carter, Lieutenant Henry Hank Tank, and firefighter George A. Sumners. All 3 men died while trying to save others the night of the flood. There was a rescue operation right around 11 o'clock that night. The fire department still has a helmet on display within the main building that was recovered decades after the flood was done. Highway patrol is less known about. This image, I actually have a soft spot for this image in that one of our best friends, my husband and I's best friends, was a trooper for a very long time, and his number was HP 72. And that's the number of this patrol vehicle right here. This photo comes from Keystone Historical Museum. South Dakota Highway Patrol had 45 men working full-time in and around the flood zone. The men were asked for men to be sent to Lieutenant Anderson in Rapid City to report there immediately, and they set up roadblocks around Rapid City and Keystone and then manned them for days afterwards to prevent the influx of traffic from taking away from the rescue efforts that were happening. There's a couple of other stories I've heard and read about from the Highway Patrol. A trooper was actually sent out to Pactola to make sure that the dam never broke during the night of the flood. The trooper in question sat there and watched and reported back hourly on the radio stating, no, it hasn't broken yet. No, it's still intact. No, it hasn't broken yet. There was also a dispatcher who stationed himself up on Skyline and was asked to report and continue to make sure the radios work from Skyline Drive. Talking about the National Guard, the South Dakota National Guard was actually in Rapid City and the Black Hills area and the Badlands due to training. So what we now know as Golden Coyote actually had training happening at the time of the flood. And in fact, I believe they had just completed training, like it was their final weekend that they were in town when the flood hit. In total, the National Guard counts 2,952 personnel involved in the flood. This includes rescue efforts the night of the flood. This includes evacuation efforts, and it includes cleanup efforts as seen on this photo. The National Guard states the report that they issued states that they worked nonstop for recovery until June 30th, 1972. After June 30th, the National Guard was still around and still helping, but it wasn't around the clock help anymore. So an interesting fact that I just found recently, during the prior year, 25 technicians from Camp Rapid had actually gone through disaster response training. It was a volunteer program for emergency rescue and response. And they had also completed training in May that covered first aid and light and heavy rescue operations. So Camp Rapid had 25 men who had just trained on this very thing, accessible and ready to go for this disaster, which I found very interesting. This report also states that over 1,000 lives were saved purely by South Dakota National Guardsmen. When I read that, I thought that number would be very low. Because when you think about how many people lived along the creek and how many people were in floodplains that night, the number was much more than 1,000, and that National Guard only counts up to 1,000 is, it seems to me to be a very low number. I would expect that number to be much higher. South Dakota National Guard lost 3 men that night. All 3 men were, of course, attempting to rescue others. The loss of life included, and this goes in order of the photos from left to right, Second Lieutenant Gary M. Engelstad, First Sergeant Myron Henry Corbin, and PFC Freeman Franklin Phillips. A 4th National Guardsman did lose his life the night of the flood. His name was Russell Gordon. Russell Gordon took his own life after mistakenly directing others the wrong way for rescue efforts and causing one of the lives to be lost. The Journey Museum and Learning Center was doing research on this. He was originally listed in the flood fatality list, and then he was taken off the list in 1972. And upon conversations with the police department, the fire department, the National Guard, the Journey Museum and Learning Center has not added him back to the fatalities list, not because it's not important that his name isn't on there, but because we feel that the deaths caused by the flood as secondary deaths that were caused by the flood and primary deaths that were caused by the flood are very different. And so people who had taken their own lives because of something that happened because of the flood, maybe didn't fit the fatalities list as we know it right now. That's not to say that'll never change. And we're still doing conversations with the 9/11 Museum about how they count fatalities and the Oklahoma City Bombing Museum about how they count fatalities. Research is ongoing, and fatality list is probably the most difficult part of this research that I've ever done. And I think Troy would say the same thing. And then let's talk about Ellsworth Air Force Base. Ellsworth, and this is probably my favorite picture, that is a aircraft landed at Ellsworth Air Force Base, letting off an emergency canteen. This image comes from the South Dakota Air and Space Museum. Ellsworth Air Force Base had an organization called REACT, and REACT was a rescue organization put in place through, I think it was a collaboration through multiple venues. The base, the National Guard, Rapid City Police Department, all of it. But Ellsworth did other things too. Within the first 48 hours of the flood, nearly 1,500 Ellsworth volunteers aided in search and rescue, recovery, vaccinations and hospitalizations, meals and laundry, and housing. So it is estimated in total that 3,200 individuals from Ellsworth were involved in the flood in some capacity in one of these ways overall, not in just the first 48 hours, but overall. 4,600 inoculations were given out. I believe the number is 10,000 typhoid vaccine doses were actually shipped to Ellsworth in the aftermath of the flood. The Ellsworth Air Force Base cooked meals and did laundry for the hospitals in the area because they did not have working water at the time. They flew sorties and utilized helicopters for search and rescue efforts. One of the helicopters is actually on display at the Air and Space Museum in the air park. And I do believe its sign talks about the flood on it. And they housed 190 victims, so people who lost their homes, lost all their belongings on the base. And this is really intensely important to talk about because they opened their base to citizens of Rapid City in the Black Hills, even though we are deep within the Cold War. And the base was, I mean, there were nuclear capabilities on that base at the same time. So they opened up the base to help individuals from Rapid City and the Black Hills area, even though there is the Cold War happening at the same time, which I always find fascinating. Ellsworth lost 7 individuals that night. 5 of them died during their actions during the REACT recovery and rescue efforts. Now, there are only 4 pictured, and I have a specific reason why. These individuals, Airman Blake Evans Thornton, Airman Richard Mundell, Sergeant Billy Noble, and Staff Sergeant Marvin Eugene Pepper all lost their lives. Airman Thornton and Staff Sergeant Pepper were trying to rescue children when they died during the night of the flood. The 3 other individuals who died, we don't have images for. These individuals are Staff Sergeant Otis W. Matthew, Airman William Harold Ruff, and Sergeant Bran Terry Towner. Images are still missing. Ellsworth's report is very long. It's got a lot of very specific numbers in it. They had 14 aircraft fly in from out of state to help recovery efforts after the flood. Other responders include Major and Commander William Medley, who died the night of the flood. He was the Major and Commander of the Salvation Army in Rapid City. He was rescuing others when he died. His wife, Joy Medley, not to give too many spoilers for next week, but his wife took up his mantle and continued to work even after she had found out her husband had died in the aftermath of the flood. And then responders in the aftermath, and this is probably one of the most interesting parts of everything that happened. The U.S. Marshal Service, the deputies of the U.S. Marshal Service actually worked on body recovery and just general recovery efforts after the flood, and they utilized their federal capabilities to help with body location, finding individuals, identification, and cleanup, which is really not necessarily what you would think a deputy U.S. Marshal would do, but very appreciated nonetheless. Canine teams were flown out from Missouri and Pennsylvania in the aftermath to help find the fatalities. And then the church services, of course, we're talking the Catholic Church. Mennonites came through and helped recovery efforts. There were multiple people here in Rapid City helping the recovery efforts after the flood. So what don't we know? I often say we don't know what we don't know, but in this case, I can tell you we don't know the names of all the first responders, especially those who came out of state. Those stationed at Ellsworth Air Force Base, we don't know their names. And it's difficult to find out their names sometimes because some things at Ellsworth are still classified. And so access is kind of regulated. We don't have, the other thing we don't have is we still don't have images of all the fatalities from the night of the flood. I think we're missing over half of the images still to this day. And that can be seen on the library website. On that note, I have no other presentation. I have no other parts of this presentation, but I am willing to answer any questions anybody might have. I haven't given a presentation in a while, so I'm glad I got to do this one.
Okay, so if you guys have a question for Corey, I'm gonna need to come over to you with my microphone so that she can hear your question. I think I do want to add a couple of things. Corey and I want everyone in the room to know that the journey is committed to ongoing research. So 2022 marked a significant date in terms of commemoration. So much of this history is difficult because of how fast everything happened. And Corey spoke of the different levels of challenges in terms of acquiring history. And so one of the things we want to make sure you guys all know as audiences is we're going to keep at it. Back before the pandemic, we would have an intern in every summer to help us continue to research, and it's easy to push hours and hours of time into just finding out something about one person. So it's fairly, what's the right terminology for that, Corey, as you dig through history? I mean, it's,
it is fairly, I don't want to say time consuming because that makes it sound like a chore, and it's not a chore, but it takes a lot of time to make sure you have the correct research and the correct sources of data of what you want to find.
all right. So just wave your hand at me if you've got something. You're going to recognize this voice, Corey.
I'm sure.
Here. The question on that the first slide you showed, I believe you said that it was taken on June 12th.
Oh, of the police department.
Right.
Yes, it was taken the night or the morning of June 9th. The day of the flood, this building actually flooded completely. The basement was completely washed out, and the police department lost 90% of their records from the basement of the from the flooding.
Just curious how it happened. To have a photo on the day of the flood.
I'm not sure how this photo came about. I'm pretty sure, if I were to guess, the chief of police went, we need a photo of everybody. And so everybody came and just took it. The way the Journey Museum got access to this photo was, I have a very good working relationship with the Rapid City Police Department, and the police department historian went, oh, I have this photo I want to show you. And I flipped over the back of it, and it says, taken the morning of June 9th, 1972, before the flood. I was like, can I have a copy of this, please? And they gave it to me. also in this image, and I can't believe I haven't noticed it until now, but this gentleman right here is Officer Sam Roach. So Tom Hennies is right here, Lieutenant Tom Hennies, and then Officer Roach is right here, this individual.
Interesting coincidence. Well, while I have the mic, I'll ask another quick question. Your focus is basically on, all our mind focuses on Rapid City, whereas there are, of course, were people killed elsewhere in the flood. Any idea what sort of proportion that might have been outside of the city, Keystone, whatever?
I'm not sure. We've not heard of any first responders dying outside of Rapid City. The highway patrol vehicle, that photo was taken outside of Keystone, but we were told that that individual got out of his car before that occurred. There is a chance that there are more individuals that we have just not accounted for fatalities of the flood. And that's why we're doing that research, because it is difficult to say, what if there were campers up by Custer State Park? What if there were campers up in Nemo that we just don't know about? So we're still working on that. I hope that answers your question.
Corey, let me add on a little bit to that. I think Fred asked a great question. I think he wasn't being as specific as first responders, but it has a lot to do with why we call it the Black Hills Flood. Because as an example, one of the photos was from up in Keystone. Casey Sullivan, who's the executive director up there and was an intern here at the Journey. We have, the number is 14 deaths that were outside of the Rapid City area that Casey had connected on his list. Corey, I think that's what a little bit of what Fred was touching on. One of the reasons this got to be known as the Rapid City Flood, Mayor Barnett tried to put national audiences at ease to come to the Black Hills for tourism. So he said all of the flood damages were in Rapid City. Everywhere else was okay. But the reality is there was some lives lost in the Keystone and Nemo areas. And I think Casey had a list of about 14 of that fatalities that were up in that area. And so, as he, part of what we're getting the opportunity to do as a museum is go back and say, well, how did it get known to be the Rapid City flood when there was deaths in Keystone and the Southern Hills? And obviously the water didn't just show up in Rapid City. It came from north, came through dams and took out a lot of structures. So part of what Corey's talking about too is, to the best of our knowledge in some of these places, but then how did it get to be known as the Rapid City flood? We think Mayor Barnett has a lot to do with that, because Governor Knipe was wanting to make sure that we were communicating to the world that there was still tourism available, and so just drive around Rapid City and everything will be great. So
Yeah, I believe what they said was the Black Hills are still open. You can drive around Rapid City, the interstates are open, you can get wherever you want to go see Mount Rushmore. That was their response after the flooding was completed.
I think Mayor Barnett was on the Today Show when he did that.
Yep.
So, other questions or comments from folks? I'm bringing the microphone over.
I didn't hear that question. I'm sorry.
Her question is in regards to the Pennington County Sheriff's Department was not included in the first responder list.
That the Pennington County Sheriff's Department responded just as the police department did. They had, I think, less than 100 men at the time, but they were all actively responding the same as the Rapid City Police Department did. Men were called from off duty. And then Chuck Childs, who was a probationary officer with the Pennington County Sheriff's Department, actually spearheaded the missing list after the flood. And he got the list down from 5,000 people to 5 individuals who are still missing, considered missing to this day, from June to November of 1972. So the sheriff's office did respond. The sheriff's office, they did not have a report in the Blue Book. I did not see one, but the sheriff's office has been instrumental in helping the Journey Museum's research as well, ongoing here. So.
Yeah, the sheriff's office has been very engaged with us over the last year, just assisting. As part of our research, we have, Corey has found names that could be potentially related to this. And so they work with us in terms of looking at those files. And again, there's been some loss of files throughout the area too, in terms of that history for a variety of different reasons. And so that's made that challenging on this end too. And so Corey, did you want to share anything with the audience as far as, future research? This has been obviously a big year to mark the commemoration and then talk about everything that's been going. But as you're looking ahead, what's your thoughts there?
For research opportunities?
Yes.
A research opportunity I'm very interested in is, well, obviously besides fatalities, because that is a huge undertaking in and of itself. I'm interested in the influence and growth of tourism after the flood. I find it interesting, the parallels that can be drawn between the 72 flood and the pandemic response in South Dakota. I'm interested in reading more into how the flood influenced McGovern's presidential campaign and how it influenced Nixon's presidential campaign and how it played a part in the politics of the 70s. And I think I'm also interested, what I would like to dig more into is the mental health aspect of the flood. There is a report in the Blue Book that specifically talks about the mental health of individuals during and after the flood. But fatalities are most interesting. I want to learn more about the individuals who died. There's a woman who supposedly had survived the Holocaust and married an airman and was living out in Rapid City and died during the flood. And so I would love to learn more about her story. I want to know more about the first responders themselves. But because this was 50 years ago now, we're running out of time. So I'm always digging and I'm always looking for more information.
Thank you, Corey. Just looking at the police department photo, I'm thinking of Fred's question. Another unique timing thing that I like to share, and that is that morning, also June 9th, was when Colonel George Bennett started. That was his first day at Ellsworth Air Force Base. So his first day on the job at this event. And Colonel Bennett was highly decorated and was awarded Ellsworth as sort of a retirement gift of coming to the beautiful Black Hills and get one more year before you get out of the Air Force. And instead he got the 1972 flood experience. But we were lucky to have this gentleman because he was no ordinary guy, which a colonel isn't. This guy is really aligned. Would you like to share something on that, Corey?
He had actually been utilized for Air Force disaster response at some of the bases he had been at, like training response. So it's it's very interesting how history puts these perfect little bits of information in place. Colonel Bennett had been sworn in within 24 hours of the flood occurring.
All right, well, Well, I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. We appreciate all of you being here. This will be recorded and repurposed. Thank you for your support. If you haven't seen the flooded civic, please take that in. Well, we've got plans in 2023 to repurpose and do all of this even better so that the stories and the history continues to be honored. And we honor, we remember, and we commemorate what has made Rapid City what it is today. So thank you all for coming here today, somehow, some way, during continuing.